I'm always amazed when I think of how the digital revolution of the last 20 years, which back then we thought to spell disaster for the board game industry and hobby, actually has turned out to be a very strong ally of analog entertainment. It is thanks to that revolution that you and I can exchange ideas through the internet, that we all can access new games, we can purchase games that were hard to find before, we can get materials from print and play, from the print and play format. We have created a community that has strengthened our sense of identity. Awesome stuff. And also part of this revolution, of course, is video games, which again certainly they're a strong competitor to board games. Board games are not as popular as video games, but I like the fact that the video games do not have killed the board games, and actually sometimes they're lending ideas to board games. You remember how back in the day you had a character dying in the middle of the dungeon, and then you would have to destroy the character and replace it with a new one that would start from the beginning of the dungeon. Now you have many games in which you just respawn, and that's a concept that we learn from video games, which I think has improved board games a lot. This is a long introduction to say today we talk about Hollow Cell, which is a card and dice game with beautiful art, with large dice that are just fun to hold and to roll. So it's it's a very visual and very tactile game, definitely analog, but at the same time, as you will see, it was inspired clearly to me by arena-style video games and by first-person shooters or over-the-shoulder third-person shooters. In the game, you control a team of 3 warriors. You send them in this fairly abstract, strange, changeable environment, and you use big badass weapons to destroy stuff, but especially, if possible, to destroy your opponents. There's very strong the idea of upgrading, equipping, spending charges, spending resources, and the art, the flavor, the flow, again, is that of a super violent, quick, modern video game in card and dice format. Let's take a closer look at the game. The game comes with this pretty attractive and very functional board, although the game is not a board game, it is a card game and a dice game, but at least this board gives you a place to organize your decks of cards and to place your dice at the beginning of the game. The dice will start going around the table pretty soon, so don't expect them to be there for too long. There are various types of cards in the game. Vault cards, the ones that you use to attack your enemies, to produce weapons, to use certain special effects. Once, when you are wounded, you draw a card from this deck that will tell you the number of actual wounds that you are receiving, and that number can be anywhere between 0 and 3. You look at the wound and you place it face down in your play area. You don't tell the opponent how many wounds you received exactly. When you take 5 wounds, when one of your warriors takes 5 wounds, the warrior is dead. We'll talk about the warriors in a second. Charge cards, I couldn't really understand from the rulebook what the point of the charge cards were, but after playing the game I realized that actually they're an important element of the design, and we'll talk about those later. Sudden events, sometimes you will be asked to resolve a sudden event, and you simply flip a card from this deck and you do what the card says, which can bring a variety of effects to the game. Warriors, this is yours to say these are your avatars. Each player receives 3 cards on this deck at the beginning of the game. You place these 3 cards in your play area and then you place one of them face up. And this is the active warrior that you're using. You can only have 1 warrior out at a time. When the warrior is killed, you give the card to the player that killed it as a trophy, and you draw the next card. And you continue like this. In a 2-player game, the winner is the player that kills the 3 warriors controlled by the opponent, before the opponent does the same to you. In games with more than 2 players, the game is over whenever a player has lost all of their 3 warriors, and at the point the player with the most trophies is the winner of the game. These warriors have special abilities, each warrior has a different one, And the warriors have various slots here which you will use to equip the weapons and other tools that they will use during the confrontation. They do not all have the same number of slots. Some have more to balance the fact that maybe they do not have other interesting abilities here. The game also has turn order, player aid, and with another reminder here of how combat works. Very effective player aids. So each player will have a hand of 4 cards, a hand of vault cards. At the beginning of your turn, you can choose to discard your cards down to 1. You cannot discard your entire hand, you have to keep at least 1, and then you refill your hand until you have 5. Suppose this is what I want to do right now. Why? I don't know, because I haven't looked at the cards, just to give you an example. So you may discard your cards, and then you draw back up to 5. Then when it is your turn, you pretty much start playing cards. It's pretty free, really. You can play weapons, you can play other types of equipment, and when you're using an equipment, you pretty much place it next to your card to equip it. Now, I wish that the cards with the equipment had clear icons that tell us where they go. As you can see, when you do place them there, you see that it goes there instead of somewhere else, but pretty much this is the only reminder that you have. Why not place a matching symbol here? So the hazmat suit, I place it there. This is important because, of course, I can only equip a card if I have the corresponding slot available. You can equip weapons, and usually they go here, but then here it's pretty much a free slot. A lot of stuff can get in there, including a second weapon. Now, weapons, when you equip them, they will tell you the card will tell you to load it with a number of charge cards. This is when it gets interesting. There is only a certain number of available charge cards each game, and the number of charge cards available depends on the number of players. Say, with 2 players, we only have 5 charges here. So when I play this card, it tells me to load 2 available charge cards from the cache, which is this area here. So I take 2 charge cards and I place them. Here. When you do use the weapon, or when you discard a weapon, you discard the charge card. Suppose that I use the weapon to fire, then I'm discharging these 2 cards, and I'm discarding them, and I put them in my personal temporary discard pile. And maybe I have another weapon in my hand, and I'm going to discard this card. That's another action you can do pretty freely. And I decide to play another weapon cards, and again it tells me load with 1 available charge. Hooray! But what if I decide not to fire it? Then I'm simply keeping the charge for now. The point is, at the end of the turn, you will get the charge cards back. They're not gone. So the charge cards have 2 purposes. One is just to keep track of whether or not you fired a certain weapon. So when you use a lot of other effects, sometimes you're like, wait, did I fire or not? So if my charge card is not there anymore, I know I fired it. If it's still there, I know I can fire it. Boom, and when I fire it, I discard it. In truth, there is also a strategy here to manipulate the cache, because yes, at the end of the turn I will get the charges back. I'm recharging my weapon, and suppose that maybe here I have another piece of equipment that also holds a charge, and at the end of the turn I get it back. As you can see, my opponent only has 2 charges left there, so my opponent wouldn't be able to do the same thing that I'm doing here. Point is, if you discard your weapon, you can fire a lot in a turn. I deploy my weapon here, I fire it, and then I discard it, I get another weapon, I fire it again, etc., etc. But then all the charges that are not actually presently held by my weapons go back here, my opponent can use them. But the other strategy, of course, is to hoard the charges. Suppose that I fire this weapon only, discard it temporarily, I don't discard the weapon, then I get the charges back at the end of my turn. which is great. And that also means that I'm holding more charges here. So I can fire a lot, in which case, however, you're returning a lot of charge cards here, and the opponent may use the charge cards later, or you may be a little more conservative, in which case you can hold your charges, you're firing less, but also the opponent has fewer charges to exploit. I don't know if I made myself clear. After a couple of rounds that you played, you're like, oh, wait a second, I want to deploy this card, but there aren't any charges there. How comes? Oh, because my opponent has them. And when that happens to you once or twice, you start figuring out a couple of things. But really manipulating the number of charges that are available here by retaining some here is a pretty important element of the design. So you're playing your cards, you're again, you're equipping things to yourself. Maybe I'm equipping this card here. Other cards are actions, like the Hollow Cell, that you discard this card to use a charge card from the available cache. Again, oopsie, I cannot use this to attack you because there are no charges left. Actions, so then you simply play the card and you do what it says. There are also other cards that represent locations. They have specific effects, and well, they're places where you are at the present time. Yes, the idea is that we're fighting in this sci-fi video game arena, so we're entering a building, getting out of a building, etc., etc. These cards don't really contribute much to give you a sense of space, of organic space. It remains pretty abstract, but it is fun at least to be able to use these effects, and usually they last until the following turn because they represent the fact that you are in that location, as opposed to actions that are immediate. Now, I said you take the charges, you use the weapons, and then you discard the charges to attack. But how do we attack? Easy. The cards, combinations of weapons and possibly cards that say Hollow Cells, because those are also attack cards, will produce a number of dice. Suppose that by using this weapon and by using other effects, I get a total of 3 dice, 3 attack dice. The attack dice are red, then I simply roll these dice. And I look at the table here that tells me whether I hit or not. When the Hollow Cell die, pretty much that means this attack dice. So for each 5 or 6, when I'm attacking, that's a hit. Now my opponent may have cards that are equipped already, and that or cards that can be played out of turn that will produce defense dice. So for example here, oh, look at me, I gave you 2 hits. My opponent has cards that allow her to roll defense dice, and defense dice, as you can see, with a 6 you will defend, that is, you simply will annul, we cancel a hit. Focus means that there are certain cards, defense cards, that have a focus effect that you get to activate if you roll a 5 or a 6. 1, 2, 3 is useless. And suppose my opponent in defense rolled a 6 and a 1. The 1 is useless. The 6 is a defend, so the 6 gets to cancel one of my attacks. Now it's a single hit, and the target that receives a hit gets to draw a card from this deck. You draw a card for each hit that your warrior received, and again 5 hits means that your warrior is gone. So this is really the basic idea of combat. You produce attack dice by playing and equipping cards. You roll them, your opponent gets defense dice from the cards that they equipped, subtract the successful defenses from the successful hits, and that is the number of hits that the opponent takes. However, again, there may be focus effects that need to be resolved by the defender if 4s or 5s are rolled during the defense. A defense element, a defense procedure. 2 more things represented by blue dice. Some cards allow you to throw a grenade at the opponent. When you throw a grenade, 5 to 6, you roll a die, you roll a 5 to 6, 5 or 6, then you inflict damage on the opponent. If you roll 1 or 4, the grenade doesn't detonate immediately, and the opponent gets a chance to
throw it back at you. So the opponent, or somebody else, the opponent simply says, okay, you threw the grenade and it didn't detonate, now I'm going to throw the grenade at somebody else. Then the person that is throwing the grenade now rolls the dice, 5 to 6, the grenade gives damage to the target, otherwise, guess what? Didn't detonate yet. Now I like the idea the grenades don't detonate immediately, and so you get a chance to throw it back at your opponent. But 5 to 6, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the grenade starts like bumping around and people throw it around for so long that it just gets a little comical. There's a little bit of an almost parodic effect here. I wish that this was maybe 1 to 4 is detonate and 5 to 6 it's safe and you get to throw it back. This way a grenade becomes a reliable weapon that from time to time you may get thrown back at you. This way, you know, it's a little ineffective, a little random, and again, probably my main complaint here is that the effect feels anti-thematic. It brings a little bit of a Benny Hill element to this like grim, tough sci-fi fight. Also, speaking about the blue dice, they're used when you eat a ration. This is a radioactive word. Don't eat stuff in a radioactive wasteland. What the heck are you doing? Because when you hit a ration, you roll a die. 4 to 6 is a success. Then you get to discard a 1 card that you have in your play area. 2 to 3, nothing happens. You failed, but nothing happens. 1, which I rolled pretty much every time I ever eaten a ration in the game, irradiated, then you actually take a 1 card. These are the basics of the game. You play cards pretty freely during your turn, resolving actions, moving to locations, or should I say moving to locations, pretty much that means resolving the effect of the location, equipping cards, discarding charges to roll dice and attack, etc, etc, etc. You continue like this until you don't have any card left to play, which is not that great of an idea. You probably want to save some cards for your defense, for your defense when the opponents are attacking you. Oh yes, at the end of the turn you do get to draw a card. In any case, you play pretty freely during your turn by playing cards, attacking, etc, etc, and the opponents do the same, and you continue like this until one of the players has lost 3 warriors, has lost their 3 warriors, and at the point the game is over, and you determine who the winner is.
I like the game, although maybe it's not for everybody. I think it has some hidden or non-obvious, non-trivial layers of strategy. Although it is true that at the first sight, and maybe even a second and a third, if you don't dig a little bit, it may feel like a complete card fest and dice fest. Just go with the flow, see what happens. Oh my gosh, this is so random. I have no control over the cards that I get, what I roll. I had superior gameplay, so I managed to use more rations than the opponent. Well, you can't have the superior gameplay if you don't get those random resources. There's just so much randomness in the resources that you get. Your hand is what you have. There are ways, of course, of discarding, hand managing, but very limited things, or things that you can do in that sense. So I don't know, the superior gameplay always pays off, but there are a couple of things that you can do to try to moderate the flow of randomness. Again, and we'll talk about those in a second, but in the case, the point is still, if you don't manage to see that angle, the game can be enjoyable if you're just taking it very casually. And although some of the rules the first time you read them seem a little complex and counterintuitive, the game is actually then casual enough, is simple and linear enough that it can indeed be played as almost as a beer and pretzel first-person arena video game in card and dice format. The mechanics are casual, the components are pleasant, so you can play it as a light game, and it could work well that way. Other than that, again, the main way where you can strategize, my impression, is in how you time the playing of your cards and how you connect that to the use of charges. Since charges are a limited resource, which is shared by all players, creating scarcity in the charges, retaining some charges, even though maybe you're not planning to use them very very productively. That is not the weapon that you attach the charges with, is maybe not the one that you're really counting on, but that is hogging the charges, and then it may just be enough for the time being. And then you discard those charges to use that weapon, and then you use maybe a weapon or a strategy or a combination of resources that may be better. So you have that element there, which to me actually is probably the main space of actual decision that you have in the game. Again, because with the randomness, some decisions, yes, you're making them, but they're obvious. When it is really about strategizing a little bit more, it is to me when you're planning the sequence in which you are playing your cards, because playing them in an order rather than another will consume certain resources, may weaken the opponent, and then you use another resource to exploit that weakness. Basically, you can create a certain condition. You may launch an attack with the purpose of encouraging the opponent to spend some defensive resources, and then you proceed with your main attack. Those are interesting things. Of course, that also means that when the opponent is attacking, you're trying to read the opponent to figure out if that is their main attack, and then I'm going to commit all or most of my defenses to it, or if something bad is coming next. So there is that element there, and the fact that, for example, you roll dice and you can spend resources outside of your turn, to me that is also quite interesting, because then you're not playing in a 4-player game 25% of the game, but because you are entertained as you're actively defending against the opponents, you have decisions to make outside of your turn, downtime is not that much of a problem, and so on and so forth. And in general, I don't think downtime could be or would be much of a problem. Of course, that depends. When you're 4 players, if somebody's playing this as a tight Euro game in which they're going to use the cards with the best of their possibilities and making sure that all the algorithms fall into place, then yes, it can be painful to play with those players. But per se, I think the game is meant to be snappy, is meant to be fast. It should be about the fun of using these gigantic weapons and blowing stuff up, rather than crunching numbers and calculating odds in too much detail. The one thing that I think I mentioned already, which is the grenades, I wish they hit a little bit more and didn't bounce around so much, simply because it feels not even necessarily anti-thematic. Weapons that don't work very well can be thematic. Historically, we have had a lot of those in our real world. We could have them in a sci-fi world too. It's just anti-atmospheric. It doesn't really... These bouncing grenades start acting like tennis balls. They look... they do not fit well with the grim, dark, intense atmosphere that the other components summon in the mind of the players. In general, this is a good game. I like it. There is a massive random element that you have to make peace with if you want to enjoy the game. It is true, in a certain sense, there's also a bright side there. There's in fact so much randomness that within a single game you'll get some crazy good and some crazy bad rolls, or some terrible cards and some excellent cards, and everybody will go through that, so things will even themselves out a little bit, but still not everybody enjoys that. Within that tsunami of randomness, you still have some interesting decisions to make, which give a further layer to the game, without making it too complicated, without making it, in my opinion, any more than a fairly casual game. So for a casual, simple, quite intuitive game, when you know what you're doing, then I think the Hollow Cell is a good option. Also, if you have that friend who is addicted to video games, this could be a transition towards some little games. You tell them, look, this is kind of the same thing, and before they know, then they've been relieved of their horrible addiction to video games, and they have a wonderful addiction to board games and card games and dice game. In general, there are uses that you can find for Hollow Cell, but again, in general, a fun, fairly simple, casual game.